in real time. How do we help students learn within that?
What stories do they have to share? And are there...
Got me to understand, they can't get food.
Fourthly, they need to foster a healthy disregard for the impossible.
Have y'all ever realized
Okay, great. I really embrace the idea of Greater Nashville in that I am from Virginia Tech, about 7 hours away, but I've known Bob for about 5 years, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to come down to Nashville and observe and participate in TED. What I'm going to talk about today are technologies, new emerging technologies that have the potential to be disruptive and that they'll change the way that we do things and might prove to be revolutionary. Now you'll see a number of icons coming up on the screen here, and they're probably technologies that maybe you have an account with, or you own these technologies or use these types of technologies. Maybe you have these technologies in your pocket right now. Maybe you're Twittering right now. So certainly these technologies have the commonality that they are indeed technologies, but given my work at Virginia Tech, I'm very much interested in how these technologies and emerging technologies can be used for education. So I want to talk about some new emerging technologies and how basically what I've termed the pedagogy of things might show how they can be used in educational settings. And pedagogy basically refers to teaching practice. So it's sort of like how do we use new technologies for teaching. There have been essentially 3 waves of computing that we've seen thus far. And the first wave was the mainframe technology, kind of predating the 60s all the way through really the 1990s. And the second wave of computing was the personal computer, so it sort of started in the late 70s, 80s, certainly until today. Probably mobile computing, cell phones, smartphones would be considered part of that wave. But there's a third wave of computing that's coming about, and actually it was conceived of about 20 years ago by a guy named Mark Weiser and his group of researchers at Xerox PARC. And basically, that group felt that we were misplacing the emphasis on the personal computer. And what needed to happen was that technology would essentially disappear into the environment around us, so that there's always sort of computing around us in the same way that we have access to technology in exactly the same sorts of ways. And what we're seeing is we actually are moving in this direction, where we're starting to see these technologies kind of disappear into the landscape around us. So some examples. The Chevy Volt is one of the first cars that actually has an IP address, an Internet Protocol address. In other words, it's actually wireless and on the internet, so you can access your car from your cell phone, from your laptop. Also in our homes, we're seeing thermostats that have IP addresses, so you can adjust the temperature in your home from anywhere in the world. But I want to call your attention to really what's here in the bottom right corner, and this is sort of a new set of innovations that are coming about. That's actually just a simple pollution sensor, that there's a wand that goes down into the water and it's checking the pollution levels within the water, and then it's wireless, it's on the internet, and it's collecting data essentially that anyone can access. So there's a free app for the iPhone called Pollution, and I checked it out just a couple of days ago, and there's nearly 60 pollution centers here in the Nashville area that you can kind of gain access to. And pollution is really just one example of the types of things that are showing up out there. There's a new kind of technology called physical mobile interaction, PMI, and you've probably seen some examples of PMI with these QR codes. Right, you see these codes and you take a snapshot with your phone or your iPad, and it will return a web link, data, photos, email address, things like that. Well, imagine this technology where it's less active. You're just sort of walking through downtown Nashville, and then your phone buzzes in your pocket, and then you realize you've just been given information, and then you can sort of provide information back. It's sort of real-world social networking where you're sharing information just by moving through the world. Those technologies certainly exist. And Mark Weiser's group referred to this idea as the Internet of Things, where there'd be lots of things out there on the internet that we could interact with. And right now, there's we're approaching about 2 billion people on the internet. And they are thinking that we may have just surpassed the number of people on the internet by the number of things on the internet. And by things, I don't mean cell phones, but these nodes that are collecting data. So over 2 billion nodes that are collecting data, sharing data, basically extending the idea of social media. But for me, given my work, I'm mostly interested in how this Internet of Things that now is truly a reality, though it's kind of invisible, we're just now sort of recognizing that all of these tools are available to us. I'm trying to see how these can be used in teaching and learning settings. So what do we know about teaching? Well, one thing we know is that teaching and learning are active processes. To learn, we'll learn better if we're actually actively engaged in what's taking place in a learning setting. We also know that social interaction increases learning, that if we can achieve up to this level by ourselves, but if we're able to work with someone else or work with a teacher or work with a peer, we can actually achieve greater. There's a third idea that kind of talks about the value of authenticity in learning. So real-world settings where we're actually engaging in content in the actual setting in which we will see it in the real world. So think about biology labs when they have you dissect frogs. You dissect frogs because you'll learn it, you'll understand it far better by doing it rather than reading about it or watching a demonstration. Same thing for chemistry. You have labs where you actually mix chemicals together, see what happens. That's kind of referred to broadly as experiential learning, and there are a number of programs that actually have students out in the real world, and maybe you've participated or your children have participated in Outward Bound or Study Abroad, service learning, or other types of volunteerism. So it's students, people learning in the real world, but the very nature of what you can do in the real world is changing. So that's where the idea of the pedagogy of things comes in. And the pedagogy of things really embraces the idea of trying to take advantage of the new technological capabilities that are part of the real world. So learning has very much looked a lot like this, kind of like what we're doing in this room right now, where there's not necessarily a lot of interaction, we're all facing forward. Let's see if this model might shift more as time passes to something like this, where people are actually out in the real world, they're using technology to interact with one another, to be the basis for interactions with one another as they learn within the real world. So how do you participate? Well, one thing to note is that the infrastructure is already there. Many of us have mobile devices in our pocket, broadband is easily accessible, and this Internet of Things truly does exist. But I think the real challenge is for us to be able to ask the right kinds of questions. What do you want to learn? Or if you're teaching, what do you want your students to learn? And that's the real difficult challenge, I think, is being able to start asking questions in real time. How do we help students learn within that specific kind of real-world environment rather than sort of looking back and trying to do research in a fashion that involves Google searching but actually does research in the real world. And only by sort of being able to invert that questioning process will you be able to really take advantage of what I see as the pedagogy of things. Thank you.